So, Stefan, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we go into the future, can you tell us a little bit about your own background? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pretoria. I wasn't born in Pretoria, but I spent my entire school and university career in Pretoria, and then left for a couple of years and ended up back in Pretoria, strangely enough. So it can truly be my hometown.
And what was your dream career when you grew up?
I've always wanted to be a tax consultant. It's something that I knew at the age of 9 already, when my father one day asked me if I was interested in working in the family business, which was an IT business. It was a computer data processing bureau in those days. And I told him quite emphatically that he did not need to or should not want to keep the business for me, because I was going to be a tax consultant. And ironically, that's what I am today.
So what attracted you to the tax profession? Was it the numbers? Was it the science? What exactly would you say was the attraction about?
I suppose I was born with some sort of philosophical understanding of tax, because I do seem to have an understanding of the philosophy of tax law, but it always intrigued me that here was this thing that my father used to hate so passionately, and yet I thought that there's got to be something more to it than something to hate, you know. And we read about it in the Bible, about people complaining about taxes being collected, and yet Jesus told them to give unto Caesar what is his due. And it always intrigued me that there was something more to tax and tax law, and that it could actually be used for the greater good of people. And I think in a real sense it is, you know. And as I've got older, I've come to understand that is what taxes are meant for. That it can better the world if used productively and correctly. So I'm kind of pleased that I ended up where I am with tax as a profession.
And tell us, who inspired you in your early days?
Dr. Nick, I can't really name any specific person. You know, over the years, I've sort of kept a list. Well, not sort of, I have kept a list of people that have affected my life at my various life stages. And currently there's a list of over 60 people who have all had a major influence on my life during the various aspects as in my different life stages. And, you know, they've inspired me in different ways. People have affected me spiritually, competitively, academically. So it's very difficult for me to pick out one person or just a handful of people, because I've had so many people that I've interacted with and who've interacted with me and who have affected me positively.
So, Stefan, you started your career at Kaplan & Kaplan, which I assume is or was an auditing firm.
Yes, it was.
And then you moved to SARS. You spent almost 4 years at SARS as a senior tax officer. Can you tell us a little bit about your work at SARS?
Yes, so SARS came about. It was an opportunity that arose for me to avoid going to the military. At the same time, it enabled me to specialize in tax whilst I was there. So I worked for them under a 4-year contract. And my work there was broad, and it gave me a very, very broad exposure to not only tax law, but the economy, because I started off assessing company taxes. I then did company tax audits. I got involved with the special investigation division. And out of that and some of the investigations we did, I was asked to investigate the labor broker situation that had been developing on the Mosgas project down in Mossel Bay. Now, I mean, given that I was based in the old Vaal Triangle in Vereniging, the reason that it ended up there is that Doorbell was the main contractor for manufacturing of what they call the jacket, which is that rig that sits in the sea. And that was being made up there. So this labor broking community evolved where they would pirate staff away from Doorbell, and they would re-employ them into Doorbell, but under the banner of this labor broker, and no taxes were being paid over for these people who were previously paying pay-as-you-earn whilst employed by Doorbell, but now that the labor broker had them under his wing, suddenly there was no taxes forthcoming. So I was tasked to investigate that. And I basically spent 3.5 years performing that investigation and taking it all the way through. And it ended up with legislation being changed. We implemented the labor broker and subcontractor terms into the 4th schedule of the Income Tax Act. And that has subsequently evolved into what is known as the personal service provider regulations, which really define in a broader or a better sense how contractors and subcontractors contract their services to a company, be it as private individuals or through companies and close corporations. So that journey, took me through to the end of my contract with SARS. I think the legislation was only signed officially 6 months after my contract had ended. And I then left SARS to pursue other opportunities.
And then you joined the IT industry, I believe. You joined Capital Computers as the financial director.
Yes, Capital Computers is in fact the family-owned business that I told my father at the age of 9 that he should not keep for me. And what happened there, and it was sort of maybe the one wrong turn I made in my career, is what happened was at the time, mainframes were being phased out and PCs became prominent and necessary. And the family convinced me that my services as a chartered accountant, as opposed to a tax consultant, were needed within the family business. And I then joined the family business to see what I could do to help with the new developments that were coming, because the old data processing computer bureau was being changed and was evolving into what we know today as application service providers, ASPs, and hence the fact that I did join them, despite having once told them that I'm not interested in it at all.
Right. And then you went into the insurance industry, and I believe you co-created Unifi Africa, right?
Yeah, so Unifi Africa, I used really what, the need for a full-time CA in the family business. They didn't need one full-time, and it wasn't a 30-day a month job sort of thing. So I took a system that we had developed within the business, within the family business, and we had sold and implemented it locally, nationally, and internationally in the Middle East and the United Kingdom. And I set up an insurance administration company called Unifi Africa. And it was the first paperless system in South Africa, insurance, short-term insurance-based system. It was the very first paperless system that had all sorts of neat functions and functionality for remote quotations by insurance brokers, and they could initially email them in, and it would be, we had a program that downloaded the data off an email and programmatically generated quotations, sent them back, and we generated. So that Unifi Africa business was sort of the forerunner to web-based systems in South Africa, which all insurers eventually followed suit and developed by around 2006-07, I would think. Most of them got onto the internet platforms and the web platforms, and
yeah.
And so that's really what I did there in the insurance industry. So we administered, during those years, we outsourced administration capability of quotations, claims administration, policy underwriting, and premium collection to insurance companies. Because of our electronic and paperless capacity, we were able to do it cheaper than what insurance companies could do it themselves. But by around 2010, in fact, that niche or that benefit that advantage had largely dissipated because insurance companies themselves developed the same capability and capacity. And hence the fact that at that point I then left, I then closed the company down and turned to my core competence of tax again.
And today, Stephan, you're regarded as one of the top 5 tax practitioners in the country who have written components of the tax law, South African tax law, and you helped the construction company restructure in such a way that they achieved the 250 million rand tax saving. Can you maybe just touch on how important is the correct structuring of companies with regarding to tax and tax savings?
Sure, Dr. Nick, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, because there's a plethora and a legion of tax court cases where shareholders suffer almost punitive damages from, tax damages when they leave companies, and whether they retire or pass away or become disabled and are forced to exit the companies, and causing all sorts of problems. And SARS's assessments on these things are aggressive. SARS adopts the attitude that they raise estimated assessments on worst case scenarios and then leave you to fight it. And because our tax law is a kind of a you're guilty until proven innocent thing, you sit with these challenges. So I can't emphasize enough, and especially in the South African context where we struggle, we don't have the same educational levels. We are an immature society, and hence the fact that the need arises to educate and explain and teach people about how to structure companies efficiently from not only a tax perspective, but it actually has a wider impact. The minute you structure your company tax efficiently, you end up with all sorts of other benefits along the way, like cost efficiencies. And in reality, tax should just be a cost to a business. That's how you should actually view it. We don't, because our tax rates in South Africa are so high. That's another belief I have, is that tax rates should be lower, and that you can actually just treat it as an expense and budget for it. And then I think tax evasion and tax fraud would largely disappear. But that's a personal opinion that I have. I'm supported in that, however, by Ireland, which has implemented exactly that methodology, and they concur that tax fraud and evasion has disappeared completely by virtue of lower tax rates. And all of that just comes about the minute you structure companies properly, and then they learn to embrace tax as opposed to hating it or disliking it, and suddenly tax revenues increase because companies are happy to, although they pay less, you've got more companies paying and contributing to the tax base, so you actually widen the tax base. So this whole concept of restructuring companies sort of has that benefit, and we can only go and do it one company at a time. So as we find people that are interested, we change it and implement the changes, and then the word spreads. So it's a word of mouth thing more than anything else I've found.
Right. And tell us, looking back over your career, Stephan, what was a major turning point where things could have gone different?
Well, there were two turning points, where things could have gone different. So when I finished my contract at SARS, I was Ernst & Young offered me a full tax partnership, and I turned them down because I was going into the family business. And I think, that was a point where things could have ended up differently. And then after that, in 2010, which I mentioned earlier, when the insurance administration company sort of reached a cycle where we weren't really offering a cost benefit to insurance companies anymore because they had the same technology as we had, I was experiencing what I would call professional misery. And when I assessed myself and I realized it was because I had left my core competence, which was tax. And the funny thing was, during all those years in the family business and my time in the short-term insurance industry, people and companies never stopped approaching me for tax advice and assistance. And I probably did way more pro bono work than anything else from a tax angle in those years. And I sort of came to this realization that I need to get back there. And so in 2010 or the end of 2009, I took that decision and said, right, let me get back to what I always wanted to do. And the rest, as they say, Dr. Nick, is history.
Right. And tell us, Stephan, what is driving you today?
My drivers today are twofold. When I decided to go into my core competence of tax 10 years ago, the first objective I set myself was that I wanted to help 1 million people. Don't ask me how I determined that number, but I thought, using my core competence and skills of tax, I could help people to improve and better their lives in many respects. The minute you teach somebody to embrace tax and understand it and not resist it, then they actually feel better about themselves. And it's amazing to see businesses get better and grow the minute they start paying their fair share of taxes. The whole psychology in a business changes. So that was something that I thought I could always do, and I've certainly proved that. I think many of my clients today will attest to that fact. And then the other driver for me today is that I've always had a burning passion to actually make a meaningful contribution to society. And in a South African sense, it's about transformation and making the country a better place for everybody, having a truly inclusive society and not prejudicing any specific group, whether you're a majority or a minority. And so I've been involved in Black empowerment transactions since 2004, and it's something that I still actively am involved in through my expertise with tax. And I provide tax guidance and assistance to many, many empowerment transactions. Today, I'm involved in the IT and agriculture sectors in terms of transforming them and applying my skills and knowledge there to assist farmers and IT companies to transform and become more inclusive companies and businesses. So those are my major drivers.
Right. Well, you're currently, Stephan, championing transformation in the agri sector. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your involvement in that sector?
Yeah, so it's specifically, my involvement is really geared around the structuring of businesses and groups of companies, and then getting back to the tax efficient structuring of these companies, exactly the conversation that we were having earlier. And so you find all these weekend farmers who could actually be more productive and actually solve the food scarcity problem that exists in the world today. And all these people are either operating as sole proprietors and really not knowing or understanding what they can do. And they don't have to be big companies. They can continue as sole proprietors, but just structure their business operations more tax efficiently. And that's my expertise. I'm involved with a team of people. It's not just me alone. We're a team of 7 or 8 people growing as we meet people along the way. And then we enhance the whole value chain gets developed within the agriculture sector, where we teach businesses. So some communities that have received land grants under the land reform dispensation, they're now sitting on huge tracts of land that they don't really know how to use properly. So this group of people, we commercialize these operations efficiently for them so that they can deliver value to the communities that live on these tracts of land. So there's all that sort of stuff. You find them doing little bits and pieces, but not really knowing, and also providing access to funding, which is what other people within this team of mine do. And my involvement is then to ensure that whatever structures are put in place, whether it's just companies or companies and holding companies and NPOs and PBOs, public benefit organizations or non-profit organizations, all of that is involved. And that's where my skill set comes in, where I assist and help with the formation of those entities and putting them into a tax efficient structure.
So, Stephan, let's go into the future and talk about the future of leadership. And I know it's a big question, but what does the future of leadership mean to you?
For me, the future of leadership probably centers around adaptability of a leader. You know, we live in a very fast changing world in all respects, not only technologically, but in every other respect that one can think of as well. And so, you know, I think that good and necessary leaders will be those who not only continue to lead and influence people, but will do so in a manner that keeps up with the pace of change. And to do that, they will need to be nimble enough to adapt and change, not only as leaders, but to allow their organizations to change without destroying the organization or the surrounding communities that arise not only out of their workforce, but, you know, obviously interact with their companies. So that's where I see the future of leadership, is the ability to adapt to all this change going on in the world. And I think COVID has seen it. You know, if we speak to leaders today, when I speak to CEOs and CFOs and I ask them how are they adapting or coping with the new economy, some of them tell me how tough it is and others tell me how well they're doing. And I think those that have done well are those that have perhaps been prepared already for it and saying, but I think those are the adaptable people. And then there are some of those that are getting there and are already busy adapting or have adapted within the last couple of months to this new way of working and the new risks. You know, speaking to risk managers, telling me that they don't think anybody that they've met predicted or thought that something like COVID would happen. And I said to them, yes, it was, you know, it last happened 100 years ago, and we think that because of medical science and all the other advancements that these things can't happen again. And I suppose when you do anticipate these changes, then you naturally start being an adaptable person that can adapt and cope with all the change and the speed at which it does.
So, Stephan, what have you learned from your own journey that you consider most important for building future leaders?
I've probably got about 4 or 5 or 6 lessons, in fact, that I've learned from my own journey. And a number of these are mistakes I made myself, and some of them I learned from other people. You know, a very wise man once told me that intelligent people learn from others' mistakes. So I've sort of tried to do that, but not always got it right. But I think the lessons that I learned, Dr. Nick, are one, to embrace technology and legislation and not to resist it. And once we do that, we begin to be able to use it beneficially for ourselves and our organizations. And that brings me to the second lesson, which is really to embrace change instead of shying away from it. You know, don't be the ostrich that sticks your head in the sand. And adding to my comments that I made just now, where leaders need to be agile and adaptable and comfortable with challenging the status quo. So that would be probably the second thing that I've learned about leadership, being able to embrace change. A third lesson I've learned is to give purpose and meaning to my organization. People, and especially the younger generations today, are they want to see that the companies that they work for are actually contributing to the world, to making it a better place, as opposed to being purely focused on profit. And once I learned that lesson and implemented it, I discovered that I was actually able to not only attract but retain top talent in my business. And that then led me to this understanding or lesson that, you know, because of longevity of life these days, and the fact that we live so much longer and we have better health, I started to have to find ways of retaining the aging and experienced people in my company, because to let them go at the traditional retirement age of 60 or 65, you very often lose top skills and talent. And this is something that I found was a big challenge, because whilst there's this need to employ young people and develop them and nurture them because they are the future aging and experienced people who can guide and lead your organization, you somehow need to keep both of them. And obviously, to achieve all of that, you need to be able to grow your business, and that then becomes another challenge of leadership, is to understand that it's your responsibility to grow the business so that you can keep all these people on board. And then we all come across the challenge over time. We get presented, and especially in Africa as a continent, with fraud and corruption and under the hand deals and backhanders and golden handshakes and all this nonsense. So, something that I think a lesson I've learned is that to have a strong moral and ethical compass in my leadership, and to avoid the temptation of joining this gravy train, is something that has made my business and any other venture that I've had, made it sustainable and attractive for people to work for. And then lastly, I think a lesson that I've learned is, I call it it is emotional intelligence, but the ability, is to recognize my fears and my uncertainties and my vulnerabilities, and to not allow those to become stumbling blocks. And I learned that these were actually, recognizing these things like fear and vulnerability were actually the first steps to me becoming a courageous leader that would take the necessary steps to grow and develop my business and my people. When I look at TV, movies and stuff, and I saw an advert just recently, in this week, I think, where they talk about being fearless, have no fear. And it's kind of like we seem to think that we must be fearless in order to be good leaders. But when I look at people like Nelson Mandela, I think, they confronted their fears and became stronger because of it. And so that's a lesson that I've learned in my journey too. I grew up as a young man thinking that men mustn't cry and all of that lot, and I sort of realized that you can cry and you can have fears, and that once you recognize them, then you can grow. And I think those are the lessons that I've learned in my life, as in my leadership journey.
Right. And Stephan, when you speak to aspiring leaders, what is it you tell them about social media? How should they navigate social media to build their own leadership brand?
Yeah, that's very interesting, Dr. Nick. You'll notice that the only platform that I'm on is LinkedIn. And historically, up until about a year ago, I would probably have said, stay away from social media. It can just get you into trouble. But today, I think COVID has brought about this reality that we need to use social media intelligently and positively to build a brand for ourselves. And I would think in broad terms, the first part, well, let me emphasize the fact it's important today, given the scenario and the new economy and the new world order that we're in, that we need to start using social media properly. So for any aspiring leader to build a brand, I would say that the first thing you've got to do is to define the goal or the objective of your brand. What are you wanting to achieve out of this brand that you need to build? And whether that be to build a business or grow a business, or simply profile yourself so that people can get to know you and you thereby increase your audience in the world out there, of people who begin to recognize your skills and knowledge to either bring you business or give you business or employ you. You've got to identify that objective. And in order to identify that objective, I guess you need to identify and specify what your special skills are. And I think I was listening to an American asset manager recently, and he said the key to becoming a successful business is that as a leader, you have to have at least one thing that you are really, really very good at, and possibly the best in the world at. So as as a leader building a brand, I think you need to have something that you're very good at, and then you need to specify that as part of building your brand, because it makes people realize or decide how they should recognize you. And then within that framework, you develop what I call a brand statement, where you identify yourself and your skills as this brand. And the important part here is actually that I think you've got to learn how to connect that to your target market or your audience, the people you want to reach. You know, you've got to find, it doesn't help me to sit here and tell you that, geez, I'm this tax genius that developed some new tax law, but I can't make that message resonate or connect with my audience out there. So that becomes an important angle to consider. And I think, in my personal view, that's something that I have possibly struggled with the most in my career, is to how to make this message resonate with my target market and to draw them into me. And then, as I said just now, you know, I'm only on LinkedIn, but I think to build a social media brand, I would think you need to utilize more than one channel. How one does that and finds the time to do that, I think is a trick. But I really think that would be important, and it's something that I'm still having to have a look at going forward. And obviously, once you use multiple channels of social media, you need to ensure, I think, a consistency of message and brand across all those channels. And that's about what I think I would tell anybody that's wanting to do this. You know, I've recently embarked on this social media branding exercise with yourselves, and these are sort of the overriding lessons that I think I can take out of my involvement with you.
And Stephan, what is your advice for future leaders in terms of challenges? What would you say are some of the biggest challenges future leaders are likely to encounter in their own career?
I think that the biggest challenges that we face now, one of them I mentioned earlier, was the pace of change in the world and in business. And I think the challenge of learning to recognize these changes, cope with them, and adapt to these changes, so that we, as leaders, that we lead the change and stay ahead of the game is one challenge. The next challenge that I've seen, which is an age-old challenge, I call it the battle at the cottage gate, is for leaders to know when to step back and allow others to step in order to drive a business forward and make it grow. This comes about if you, as a leader, if you know that you should probably rather create a team around you that is better and stronger and more intelligent and more capable than what you are yourself. And when you have a team like that, then this battle at the cottage gate doesn't become a battle. It becomes easy to step back and say, okay, here's the team, let them carry on. And that's an age-old challenge, and I believe it's going to be a challenge going forward, probably forever and a day. Then the third challenge that I think leaders need to see and recognize is that it's a leader's responsibility to grow the business. It's not something that you delegate to a marketing team and a sales force. They are tools necessary to execute the plan and the strategy and the growth strategy. But the responsibility for that growth, I think, lies with the leaders of the business. And that adds to another point I made earlier about once you grow your business, then you're able to retain this experienced workforce and bring in the youngsters that you can nurture and develop. And then together, they gradually and systemically replace each other and move on, you know, and then it becomes a cycle of life within the business. And lastly, I think the challenge for leaders is it's always been something, but to manage the stakeholders in the business. And this challenge arises because the number of stakeholders in business has increased over time. You know, historically, stakeholders were a couple of suppliers and shareholders and personnel, people within the business. But today it goes wider. You know, we're a global village. We interact with local, national, and international communities. And hence the fact that the number of stakeholders to any business, I think, has increased dramatically. And that's going to become a huge challenge for leadership of the future. I see specialists running around all over, and for the last number of years, I've been questioning this thing, what do these people do that tell you they are stakeholder management experts? But I think when you think about your position as a leader, then you suddenly realize that these are real issues that need to be dealt with. And if you don't have the time as the leader to deal with all of this together, you obviously need to find people and bring them into your organization to do these things and to manage these relationships at all levels, and internationally and globally. And those are the four biggest challenges that I think future leaders will face.
And Stephan, if you were to design a curriculum for future leaders, what are some of the new skills you would want to factor in?
I'm not even sure that these are new skills, Dr. Nick, but I think they've probably existed all our lives. But I think the one thing that I would say to any leader is that the process of continuous learning is probably the biggest thing, because I think it was Robin Sharma that taught me one day that learners will inherit the earth. And many years ago when I met him and I heard him say this, I thought to him, what are you talking about, Robin Sharma? Because when I wrote my last exam, I took a pen that I'd written my exam with and I threw it across a cricket field where the results were posted up, and promised myself I was never going to write another exam in my life. That was in 1986. And boy, what a change. I've written many more exams since then. I've continued learning. I spend a couple of hours every week of my life learning new things. And I think that's what's allowed me to be adaptable, because when the world changes, I'm almost ahead of the game by virtue of the fact of ongoing learning. So that to me is a skill that I think future leaders need to develop and have if they don't already. And secondly, to retain a supreme focus on your goals and objectives. In the modern world, it's so easy to get distracted that we sometimes find ourselves losing focus and taking other paths. And of course, it doesn't mean that if your objective it must necessarily be cast in stone. We can all change objectives as we learn new things. But to retain that focus, I think is important. And then thirdly, leaders need to be creative and innovative. I'm an accountant and we are typically defined as boring people. But I don't think boring is going to create good leaders. So the new ideas and the innovative ideas are those ideas that will allow us to grow and develop businesses. And I suppose that's why I didn't stay in the auditing profession, is because I like to be creative and innovative and stay ahead. I mean, that computer system that we developed in the family business that I told you about, in South Africa in those days, the largest short-term insurance company in South Africa told me that it was impossible for something like that to have been developed locally in South Africa. And yet it was. And within the 14 to 15 years that followed, the short-term insurance industry followed the lead that I think I had set. And that to me remains a critical component of leadership, to be able to do things like that. And sometimes you don't benefit initially. When you're ahead of the game and you're ahead of your time, people don't see the benefit. And so how you realize the benefit and the value in those ideas and turn them into and monetize them is perhaps a challenge. And within that, it led me to learn that the future of business and leadership is probably going to become about collaboration. To do things on your own, and I term it the lone wolf principle, is probably no longer good enough because of this vast body of knowledge that we have to deal with in the world today, combined with the technological evolution and development that's taken place. So I think future leaders will need to bring diverse skills together, not only from inside, but outside the organization as well, in order to grow the business and leverage these new ideas that they come up with and need to come up with. And then that brings you to the final understanding of all of this. So when you do this, you develop this, you have to develop this perspective that a business is not a business and it's not a little entity in itself. You know, you are, and I view it as a computer system. I look at all my collaboration and my involvement with people inside and outside my organization, and I say, if I look at this as one computer system, and we all know when you make a small change to a computer system somewhere, if you don't consider the ripple effect of that change throughout the system, you have a crash in your computer system. And I've come to view my business relationships like that as well, you know, that because of the different skills and expertise is sitting around outside that I collaborate with, like in the agriculture sector now, you know, every time I make a decision and I do something, I have to consider the impact on those people as well. You know, what I say on social media, am I disadvantaging them? Am I prejudicing them? Am I helping them? Those are things I think about every day. And I think future leaders are going to have to continue to think broader and bigger along those lines as they evolve and develop their companies and their organizations.
Now, Stephan, as a mentor to future leaders, can you maybe share a success story or two where you mentored an upcoming leader and that person took your advice to heart?
I don't have many, let me call it success stories along those lines, Dr. Nick. I don't think that I have mentored too many leaders. I've mentored a lot of tax practitioners and tax accountants to date, but if I think of a leader that I have had or that I've played a small part in developing, there's a young man he's an SMME entrepreneur in the hospitality industry, and he approached me years and years ago and asked, well, he's a client of mine, and he said, you know, to me, Stephan, I'd like you to mentor me and help me and guide me. And I think in some small way, I did manage to teach him a couple of things when I look at how he has survived with COVID, because as we all know, COVID has been completely and totally destructive in the hospitality industry. I mean, it's brought an entire industry to a grinding halt and a standstill. And this young man was providing tours, guided tours and transfer services and those sort of things. And what he's done to survive this COVID experience is he's now taken his services and his fleet of vehicles, and he now offers shuttle services for companies, for their employees who need to get to and from work. And he provides a reliable, let's call it a taxi service, for want of you know, as a very crude term, but, you know, a reliable service that can bring people to their workplace knowing that vehicles are sanitized. And he's done that. And then he's added another interesting service where he ferries or transfers disabled people to their medical, to their doctor's appointments and stuff, you know, where public transport has now become a problem. He's now provided a service for this. And so he's become totally adaptable. And he's looked at this thing, he stayed positive, and he said, well, I'm not going to let this get me down, but what can I do to survive? And he made me think also of when I read an article the other day about a hotel who's now developed a laundry service. You know, they have all this machinery and equipment. And I thought, wow, you know, this guy, he's actually been proactive, positive, adaptable, and he's doing all the right things. So, you know, there's one young man that I think I did have some sort of influence on. I don't think I did everything. I know he's had other people helping him and guiding him. He's won competitions, you know, to receive funding for his business and all sorts of leadership programs. So those have also had major influences, and it's not just me. And then I'm hoping that there's one other, you know, within the IT industry. I'm busy on a project at the moment where I've undertaken to develop a young man we're taking him onto our board as a director because of his specific skills, and I've undertaken to mentor him to be the future leader of this organization. So I'm hoping that in years to come, let's say in 2 to 3 years' time, I can brag about having mentored him into a position of leadership.
Okay, perfect. And tell us, in your career, Stephan, who are the role models of leadership that you came across, maybe in your learning journey, that you would recommend future leaders should learn from?
Dr. Nick, I've picked out a few. I think there are many, and as you go along and you read books, and I mean, I'm a great reader of autobiographies, but I think if I could just pick out 6 people that have resonated with me, and a lot of them are actually authoritarian leaders, which is not something I prescribe to. But they've had other good character traits and leadership character traits that I've identified within them. And if I could just quickly list them for you, I would think Richard Branson, for his guts as to do things, that decision to just do it, and his innate ability to enjoy whatever he's doing when he's doing it. That's something that resonated with me, and I think leaders should use that as something positive. I think obviously, everybody says Nelson Mandela. I would say the same, and my reasons for the character traits that he exuded, I think one are his statesmanship. There are very few statesmen in the world, and there have been very few, but that's one characteristic that I rated him very highly on, and which I prize and would choose for myself, as well as his charisma. I think he was a charismatic leader, and that possibly enabled him to be the statesman that he was. But I think leaders need to be charismatic. That would certainly be something. Then I think for his boldness and his collaborative approach, the collaboration part is something I've emphasized, I think future leaders need. And in that regard, I think Winston Churchill was a shining example of a man who was able to make bold decisions based on collaboration with lots of different people. Interestingly, collaboration it resonates with African style of leadership. African people are great on collaboration and joint decision making within their communities. So I think that's somebody that I would recommend that you have a look at and read about, if those are aspects that you need to pick up in your life. Another man, a military man, Colin Powell, for his ability to adapt to situations, what we call situational leadership. I think he's somebody that I've learned something from. And then a female business leader, Martha Stewart, for her perfectionism and her expertise in a given sector, is somebody that I've also read about and learned from. And then lastly, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, for her unwavering focus on her objective. She once made the statement, but the country needs to take its medicine. And I mean, many people in Britain hate her because she got rid of the unions and shut down the coal industry. But in the process, her objective was to turn the United Kingdom into an economic powerhouse. And I think she did that. She started that process. And those are the people that sort of epitomize the character traits that I think I've spoken about earlier, that I would look to and say have had an influence on my life as a leader.
And Stephan, how can our listeners get hold of you, and where should they follow you?
Currently, as I said earlier, I'm just on LinkedIn. It's the only social media platform that I'm active on. Once I've got LinkedIn under control, I will probably look at some other platforms. But for now, that's where you'll find me. And then we have a website. The website's name is thefundi.coza. And you will find me there, and there's a blog there where you can talk to me. But probably LinkedIn is the better one to find me and interact with me.
And last but not least, Stephan, is there one piece of advice that you would like to convey to future leaders that they should implement in their own life?
I think the greatest thing for me about leadership is probably a little mentioned aspect that I sort of hid away in my comments earlier about moral and ethical leadership. I think as leaders, if we are morally and ethically sound and moving in the right direction, that will go a long way, not only to improving the world as a whole, but making organizations sustainable. The gravy train is not a sustainable road. And although it has short-term benefits, you're not going to be around for a long time. So that for me is probably the most important lesson that I have for any leader, over and above all the other character traits that you need. Moral and ethical leadership, I think, is paramount.
Well, Stephan, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom into the future of leadership and reminding us that it's human centricity that is really critical and instrumental to building a better future.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Nick.
Thank you.